A ship captain nearing his mid-40s stood on the edge of a quiet dock in Norfolk, Virginia, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was the start of another routine voyage, or so it seemed. But when his eyes caught sight of an old, weathered suitcase, left abandoned in the shadows of the pier, something inside him stirred. There was no reason for it to be there. No markings, no indication of ownership, just a discarded piece of luggage. His instincts told him it was nothing important, yet curiosity tugged at him. But when he opened the suitcase and saw what lay inside, his heart raced. Among the forgotten documents, one photo stood out, a photo of his own ship at a remote location with crew members he recognized. But those faces, they had been involved in something he never knew. When the authorities arrived and saw what was inside, they turned pale. Would you dare to open this suitcase, or would you walk away? Subscribe for more stories that reveal secrets hidden in plain sight. It was still early, barely 6 a.m., when Captain Mason Carraway arrived at Pier 17, a part of Norfolk Harbor that rarely saw heavy foot traffic that time of day. The fog drifted across the water like a restless ghost, and gulls cried above the masts in sharp, echoing calls. Mason had worked the docks since he was 19. Now, at 43, he was as much a part of the port as the rusted cranes and the creaking dockboards beneath his boots. He wasn't one for drama. A seaman to the bone, stern, dependable, quiet, he'd captained the Argonaut Belle for 12 years. A cargo vessel, reliable and sturdy. She wasn't pretty, but she never let him down. That morning felt no different than any other, until it did. He was performing the same checklist he always did before departure. His clipboard in hand, Mason made his way from the security booth to the ramp leading up to the ship. That's when he saw it. A suitcase. It was sitting less than 3 feet from the edge of the dock, as if it had just been placed there moments before. The suitcase looked old, worn leather, the color faded by salt and time. One of its brass corners was dented, and a single leather strap hung loose on the side. No tag, no initials. It didn't belong to anyone he recognized. But what struck him most was that it hadn't been there just 10 minutes earlier when he'd passed by. His gut twisted. He walked over slowly, casting a glance back at the ship. A few of the crew were still loading the last crates on board, laughing, unaware. Mason crouched beside the suitcase, half expecting someone to shout, claim it, or tell him it was a prank, but no one said a word. He reached out. The leather was cool and slightly damp. He hesitated, just for a second. Then, with both hands, he lifted the lid. What he saw inside didn't make sense. Photographs, dozens of them. Old ones, some black and white, others sun-bleached and curling at the edges. Beneath them, a bundle of handwritten documents, log sheets, cargo manifests, letters. He picked up one of the photographs and stared. At first glance, it showed a dock somewhere remote. Tropical maybe, jungle trees in the background. A cargo ship pulled close to a rickety wooden platform. But the longer he looked, the tighter his chest became. Because he knew that ship. It was the Argonaut Belle. Same hull, same painted number on the bow. But the timestamp printed on the back was from 1991, 4 years before Mason had ever set foot on her. He flipped through more photos, faces of men he didn't recognize, boxes being passed between the ship and the shore, guns, not one or two, but stacks of them, military-grade rifles, crates marked in Cyrillic. There were close-ups too. One showed a man, partially turned toward the camera. Mid-conversation on the ship's deck, Mason's breath caught. It was First Mate Riley, the same Riley who, at this very moment, was supervising the cargo hold just 20 feet away. And that wasn't all. Tucked into the side pocket of the suitcase was a battered logbook, handwritten in neat cursive. Mason flipped it open. It was a shipping log, but not official. This one tracked voyages to off-grid ports, loaded with notes about alternative cargo, drop-off points, cash exchanges. Every few pages the word Argonaut appeared, followed by coordinates. Mason stood slowly, the logbook still in his hand. He looked again toward the ship. Riley glanced up and gave him a short wave, then returned to shouting orders. The suitcase suddenly felt heavy, as if it carried not just papers, but the weight of something far darker. The kind of truth that changes everything. He didn't know what to do. Mason was no fool. If the logs were accurate, his ship had a past, a dangerous one. and people still aboard might know more than they let on. He backed away from the suitcase. Then he did something instinctive. He closed it again, snapped the latches shut, and carried it on board. Not to the captain's quarters, not to the cargo hold, but to the engine room, behind a locked steel door where only he and one mechanic had keys. There, in the low light, he opened the suitcase again and laid everything out, one item at a time. He needed to know what he was looking at. He needed to understand if the crew he trusted had been part of this, if his ship had ever carried weapons, drugs, or worse, and why no one had ever mentioned it. The logs were meticulous, dated from 1989 through 1994, with matching names and locations. There were mentions of Operation Sandwave, Package K4, and abbreviations he didn't recognize, things that sounded like code names. Then he saw it. An entry from July 12, 1993. Arrived at Cove 9B, cargo delivered, bell secured. Payment received from Handler R. Photograph taken for record. There was a small drawing of a box with an X over it. Cove 9B. That was a spot off the coast of Guyana, uncharted, but known by old-timers as a makeshift port used by smugglers and illicit traders. Mason had heard stories about it, but they were always treated as legends, pirate tales told by salty captains half-drunk at the local marina bar. Only this time it was written down, documented, linked to his ship. He read deeper. Some of the pages were water-damaged but legible enough. Crew names appeared: R. Morrow, S. Delaney, and F. Riley. There was also a name he didn't expect to see, his own. Mason Carraway, listed as observer, Bell 1994, rotation pending. But that was impossible. In '94, he was working shrimp trawlers out of Tampa, nowhere near the Argonaut Bell, unless someone had been using his name, or preparing him for something long before he even joined the crew. A sharp knock jolted him out of his thoughts. "Captain, we're ready for departure," Riley's voice called from outside the engine room. Mason stared at the door. "Give me 5, he called back. His voice was steady, but inside, everything was unraveling. As the ship pulled away from Norfolk Harbor an hour later, Mason watched the dock disappear into the distance. The suitcase remained hidden, the photos locked away. No one else knew, but someone had left it for him to find. It wasn't random. It was a message, or a warning. And then, just before sundown, as the Bell sailed into open waters, Mason returned to the engine room. The suitcase was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. Only the faint smell of old leather remained. No signs of forced entry, no misplaced tools, no alerts. Mason didn't sleep that night. Instead, he reviewed every memory he had of his crew, every story that had never quite added up, every unexplained port call or schedule change. He tried to remember who had served on the ship the longest, who might have ties to the names in the logs. But no matter how far back he traced, one thing became clear. He didn't really know them. And now, he couldn't trust anyone. Someone else knew what he'd found. Someone had taken the suitcase, and that meant one of them, someone on board, was watching him. And if the suitcase had been placed deliberately, what else had been? He stared out at the black waves and wondered, had he been chosen or marked? So what do you think? Was it a warning to stay silent, or an invitation to dig deeper? Could the captain have uncovered a secret that powerful people wanted buried forever? Tell us in the comments what you would do if you found that suitcase. Would you confront your crew, hand it to the authorities, or stay silent to protect your life? And while you're down there, let us know where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss what happens next, because the mystery has only just begun. It was the middle of the night when the first hint of unease truly struck Mason. The Argonaut Bell had been sailing smoothly for hours, with the steady hum of the engines and the soft lapping of water against the hull. The sky was clear, dotted with stars, and there wasn't a soul on deck except for the lookouts and a few men below who were unloading the cargo. For all intents and purposes, everything seemed normal. But Mason couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His eyes darted over the open sea, looking for anything that might explain the creeping dread in his gut. He had seen the oddities before, the small details, the things that didn't quite add up, but never had it felt so personal. It wasn't just about the suitcase anymore. It was about the crew, his own involvement, and the lengths to which people would go to hide things from him. It was a familiar feeling, Something akin to when you're standing in a room, knowing someone is behind you, but you can't hear them move. Mason felt like he was being watched, and yet he wasn't sure who the watcher was. He spent the next hour pacing the captain's quarters, pulling out the logbooks and flipping through entries, trying to make sense of everything. His crew was mostly solid. Men he'd known for years, had seen in and out of ports without incident. But those logs, the ones in the suitcase, painted a different picture. The dates, the obscure shipping routes, the names, all linked back to him in some way. Even Riley, his trusted first mate, was involved in strange transactions. Mason couldn't ignore the glaring connections any longer. When Riley had knocked earlier, the casual tone of his voice had almost sent Mason into a state of panic. Riley had said nothing beyond, "We're ready for departure," but Mason knew something had changed in his tone. A subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but it was there, like a note played wrong in a melody. Mason stood and locked the door to his quarters, keeping everything in. It felt safe, but at the same time, like a prison. As he moved back to the bridge, he saw that Riley had taken the helm. He wasn't surprised. Riley had been piloting the Argonaut Belle for years. But the moment their eyes met, Mason felt a flicker of suspicion. Riley's gaze didn't meet his directly. Instead, it flitted quickly away before returning to the chart on the table in front of him. "Everything good?" Mason asked, forcing his voice to remain casual. "Just fine, Captain," Riley replied, his words steady. But there was something off about the way he spoke, too deliberate. Mason didn't press it further, knowing full well that the answers he sought would not come from the men he thought he could trust. The night stretched on, the creaking of the ship the only sound as Mason walked the deck, hands shoved deep in his pockets. He was acutely aware of the occasional glance he caught from one of the crew, their eyes darting away too quickly, their expressions unreadable. As the hours slipped into the early morning, Mason couldn't escape the sensation that everything was unraveling around him. The photograph in the suitcase had shown his ship docked at a remote point, a place he'd never been. But the logbook, it painted an entirely different picture. It connected his ship to something darker, something illegal. He couldn't tell whether it was coincidence. He couldn't even decide if it was an accident that he had found the suitcase in the first place. Someone must have placed it there for him to find, right? But why? What was the purpose of the mysterious warning, or perhaps the invitation, to uncover what had been hidden for so long? Mason stood at the edge of the deck, the sea mist hanging thick in the air, his thoughts racing. If the ship had been involved in smuggling, arms, drugs, or worse, it would explain why no one had ever asked too many questions about its previous voyages. There was always an unspoken code when it came to maritime business. You sailed, you got paid, and you kept your mouth shut. But the longer Mason thought about it, the more it seemed like he had unknowingly sailed into a much larger operation, one that involved people who were far more dangerous than the men aboard his vessel. Was he an unwilling participant? A pawn in someone else's game? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned sharply, ready to confront whoever it was, but he saw nothing. Only the distant glow of the ship's lights reflecting on the water. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and then, there it was. A figure in the distance, just barely visible at the edge of the ship's stern. It was too far to make out clearly, but Mason could have sworn it was Riley. He stood frozen for a moment, staring. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching the sea. "Riley!" Mason called out, his voice low and steady. The last thing he wanted was to alert the crew. The figure didn't respond. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his bones. Mason took a few cautious steps forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. As he moved closer, his gaze never leaving the figure at the rear of the ship, he noticed something that sent a chill through his spine. A suitcase. It wasn't the same one he'd hidden in the engine room, but it was unmistakably the same style, the same leather, the same old-fashioned design, and it was resting against the rail, half open. Mason's heart pounded in his chest. His legs moved automatically now, drawing him closer to the figure, to the suitcase, to the truth that had been evading him. But the figure didn't seem to notice his approach. The closer Mason got, the more it felt like time itself was stretching, elongating, as if the seconds were pulling apart. He stopped a few feet away. "Riley, what is this?" Mason demanded, his voice firm. The figure didn't turn, but then Mason heard it. A soft click, a rustle of paper, followed by the sound of the suitcase closing. Then a voice. "It's nothing, Captain." It was Riley's voice, but it sounded distant, like it was coming from somewhere far off. Mason stood still, his mind racing. "That's not the same suitcase, is it?" For the first time, Riley turned. The expression on his face was unreadable, a mask of calm that Mason had seen too many times before. "Captain, it's just old cargo. A few papers from previous trips. Nothing that concerns you." Riley's words were smooth, but Mason could see the subtle shift in his eyes. Something had changed in him, something hidden behind that facade. Mason didn't speak for a long moment. He looked at the suitcase, then back at Riley. His instincts screamed at him to dig deeper, to demand more answers, but something else held him back, something darker. "Get some sleep, Captain. You're looking worn out," Riley said with a forced smile before walking away. Mason watched him disappear into the shadows, the suitcase still sitting by the rail. Was it a coincidence? Had Riley placed it there? Or had someone else, someone from the crew, been trying to send a message? Mason felt his grip on the situation slipping, as if the world was folding in on itself. He had only been captain for a few years, but this wasn't the world he'd known. This wasn't just a routine voyage anymore. The suitcase wasn't the only thing that had vanished without a trace. His certainty about everything that had come before, the Argonaut Belle, his crew, his life, was gone too. And now, the question was no longer about what had happened. It was about who or what had orchestrated it all. The sun rose slow and heavy the next morning, casting an amber glow across the Atlantic and bathing the deck of the Argonaut Belle in golden light. But for Mason, it brought no comfort, only more questions, and the bitter residue of doubt. He hadn't slept. Couldn't. His thoughts spiraled endlessly around that second suitcase, Riley's expression, and the quiet but growing awareness that this voyage wasn't just a job. It was a test, a trap, maybe even both. He made his way below deck, passing by crewmen who greeted him with the same friendly nods and casual, "Morning, Captain," as always. But now he scrutinized every face, every movement. Who among them knew? Who had placed that suitcase on the dock, and who had taken it later that night, right from the locked engine room? The engine room. That's where he went next. He unlocked the steel door with the same key he always carried on a chain around his neck. The door groaned open. It was exactly as he'd left it, except it wasn't. The cot in the corner had been moved 2 inches forward. A wrench on the shelf had shifted slightly to the left. Small details, meaningless to anyone else, but not to Mason. He knew this room like he knew the bridge, and someone had been here. He dropped to one knee and searched behind the oil drums, under the mechanic's bench, even behind the fuse box. Nothing. Not a single trace of the suitcase. It hadn't just been taken. It had been cleaned up like it was never there, which meant this wasn't random. It was controlled. Mason stood in silence, a slow breath escaping his lungs. The smell of diesel lingered thick in the air, but beneath it, something else. Something he hadn't noticed before. Paper. A faint scent, but unmistakable. He followed it like a bloodhound, moving toward the wall-mounted ventilation system near the back of the room. The grates were covered in grime and rust, but one corner was recently wiped clean. Too clean. He unscrewed the vent plate with bare hands, pulling it loose in a few hard jerks. Behind the metal screen was a small cavity, empty at first glance, but tucked into the side, wedged tightly into a sliver of rusted pipe insulation, was a single photograph. He pulled it out. It was a different angle of the same scene from before, the Argonaut Belle, off the coast of some overgrown cove. The same crates, the same crew. But this photo had something else. A second vessel. Half hidden in the trees beyond the dock was a much smaller ship, sleek, unmarked, clearly military in build, and more importantly, unmistakably American. Mason's stomach flipped. Whatever operation had taken place out there, it hadn't just been rogue elements or smugglers. There had been official involvement. That changed everything. He stared at the photograph for what felt like an hour, barely hearing the intercom buzz as his second officer called for a routine check. His hands trembled. If the U.S. military had a hand in this, and that photo strongly suggested it, then the suitcase wasn't just a warning. It was evidence, potentially dangerous, life-altering evidence. And now it was gone. Back on the bridge, Mason laid the photo flat inside the inside cover of a naval atlas. No one would find it there, not unless they knew exactly what they were looking for. He needed to confront Riley. But how? Mason couldn't go in guns blazing. Not without more proof. Not without knowing who else might be involved. If Riley was a cog in a larger wheel, and if that wheel extended beyond this ship, then pushing too hard could cost Mason everything, including his life. So he waited, observed. He began watching his crew with the kind of detail usually reserved for surveillance cameras. He noted who spoke to whom, who disappeared below deck when they didn't need to, who lingered near the captain's quarters for no reason. Two patterns emerged. First, Riley met often with a deckhand named Gustavo Morales. Young guy, mid-30s, strong, polite, and until now, seemingly harmless. But now, every interaction between Riley and Gustavo was coded. Low voices, quick glances, hand gestures Mason didn't recognize. Second, the ship's navigator, Marnie Blake, had become jumpy. She kept a journal on the bridge, normally filled with tide tables and bearing notes. But today, Mason caught a glimpse of something else in the margins. Names, not of places, but people. People Mason recognized. Crew from old logs, the same ones mentioned in the Suitcase documents. That evening, Mason approached her quietly during her scheduled rest break, knocking on the side of her cabin before she could close the door. "Marnie, can I have a word?" he asked casually. She looked startled. "Sure, Captain. Everything okay?" He stepped inside, pretending to notice the open notebook only then. "What are you working on?" "Just some navigation notes, updating records." He picked up the notebook before she could grab it. "This doesn't look like bearings and tide tables." Her eyes darkened. "Captain, I..." "Cut the act, Marnie. I saw your notes. I saw the names. You know something. I need to know what." She hesitated, then did something Mason didn't expect. She nodded. She reached under her bunk and pulled out a smaller notebook, old and wrapped in oilcloth. "I didn't write all of it," she said. "It was passed to me by someone who used to work on the Bell. He's dead now. Heart attack, or that's what they said it was." Mason flipped it open. Inside were letters, lists, drop coordinates. Half a dozen crew members listed by full name. Several were retired, but two were on the ship right now. "Why hold on to this?" Mason asked. "Because I don't trust Riley, and because..." She hesitated. "Because I think I'm being watched." "By who?" She shook her head. "I don't know. But every time I send a message from the ship's relay, I get interference. Something or someone is intercepting transmissions." Mason swallowed hard. The walls were closing in. He left Marnie's cabin with the notebook and locked it inside a watertight locker in his quarters. Then he did what he never thought he would do. He composed a message. "To Coastal Watch Station, Bravo 6, Norfolk. Subject, unauthorized vessel history, potential federal implications, request confidential review, evidence of prior illegal maritime activity involving vessel Argonaut Bell. Suspect onboard personnel may have prior ties to military or smuggling networks. Direct contact, not safe. Awaiting encrypted response. MC." He sent it at 2:18 a.m., and he received an answer 6 minutes later. But it wasn't from the Coastal Watch. It was a plain text reply. "Stay quiet. Do not send more. They're already aware." That was all. No signature, no timestamp, no traceable source. Mason sat in silence, staring at the screen. So the message had been intercepted, and not only intercepted, but answered, by someone who didn't want him talking. He powered off the system and locked it down. The next morning, the ship's weather system glitched. Navigation went down for 17 minutes. Nothing major. A minor hiccup in electronics. Or so the crew thought. But Mason knew better. Someone was testing control, seeing what he would do. That night he found something under his pillow, a photograph, old, grainy, of him, smiling at a dock in Tampa, circa 1993. But he wasn't a captain then, and yet there he was, standing beside a cargo truck labeled with the same operation name from the Suitcase logs, Sandwave. He didn't remember this moment, didn't remember the man beside him, but the picture didn't lie, and neither did the message scribbled on the back in neat, careful handwriting. "You've always been part of it." Mason dropped the photo as if it burned. His legs went weak. What was happening? Was this blackmail? Was it psychological pressure? Or was it true? Had someone used his identity decades ago? Or had he somehow been part of something he had no memory of? His mind swam with impossible scenarios. But now it was clear. He wasn't just uncovering a secret. He was the secret. And if he kept digging, someone would come to shut him down. "Now we want to know, What do you think Captain Mason should do next? Is he being manipulated? Or has he uncovered a part of his life that was hidden from him? Leave your thoughts in the comments and tell us if you received a photo from your past that you didn't remember, showing you involved in something illegal. Would you try to uncover the truth or bury it forever? And don't forget, like this video if it kept you on the edge of your seat, subscribe to the channel to follow the story and tap the bell so you won't miss what happens when the Argonaut Belle reaches its final destination. Because secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you bury them. The storm came in fast. Mason stood at the helm, staring out over the darkening sea as thick clouds gathered like an ominous force above. The Argonaut Belle sliced through the choppy waters, her engines roaring as the storm's fury grew. A deep guttural rumble echoed through the ship, a warning of what was to come. Mason's thoughts were still tangled in the web of lies he'd uncovered, no longer able to trust his crew, his ship, or even his own memories. Every creak of the hull, every sudden gust of wind felt like the weight of something sinister bearing down on him. He had a choice. He could go to the authorities. He could confront Riley. But something in his gut told him it was already too late. He'd waited too long, buried too many questions, and now the answers were beyond his grasp. Riley. Mason had suspected him from the start, but it wasn't until the previous night that Mason had confirmed his worst fear. Riley knew everything. He had orchestrated the disappearance of the suitcase, just as Mason had suspected, and that photo, the one that had shown Mason himself involved in the Sandwave operation, had been Riley's insurance, a message, a warning. But why now? Why leave the photograph for him? Why go to such lengths to make sure Mason understood the depth of the conspiracy? The answer was chilling, because they knew Mason had already uncovered too much. It was then that he noticed a figure standing by the starboard railing, silhouetted against the growing storm. Riley. Mason's heart skipped a beat. The first mate hadn't been visible all day, and now, in the dead of night, here he was again, calm, detached, and watching the storm like it was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Riley turned slowly, his eyes locking with Mason's. There was no fear, no hesitation, just the same unreadable mask that Mason had grown accustomed to. Mason. Riley's voice carried over the storm's rising winds. You've been looking for answers. Mason's throat tightened. He couldn't even bring himself to speak. He was caught between disbelief and a crushing weight of truth. You're in too deep, Riley continued, his tone almost sympathetic. You should have stayed away from that suitcase. You should have stayed ignorant. It would have been easier for you. Mason's fists clenched. What the hell do you want from me, Riley? You and your people. What is all of this? Why involve me? Riley's expression didn't change. You were always part of the plan. Always. We needed you, Mason. We still need you. The storm howled louder now, waves crashing violently against the ship's hull as the wind whipped the air. Mason stepped closer, his pulse racing. What are you talking about? I'm not part of anything. Riley chuckled darkly, a sound that carried an unsettling coldness. You were chosen, Captain. Chosen to lead. It wasn't random that you found that suitcase. It wasn't random that you came here. Every choice you've made has been a part of a larger picture, a picture you only now are starting to see. The Argonaut Belle was never just a cargo ship, Mason. We've been running things, bigger things, for a long time. Mason staggered back, suddenly feeling the full weight of the storm's fury, and Riley's words pressing in on him. His mind raced. The involvement of the U.S. military, the names in the logs, the missing suitcase, Riley's confession. It's not just about you anymore, Riley added, his voice low. It's about what happens next. You've crossed a line, Mason, and there's no going back. Mason's throat burned. The storm, the raging winds, the unrelenting waves, it all seemed to blur together into a chaotic vortex that matched his mind. How far did this go? Who could he trust? Before he could answer, Riley turned, looking back out into the vast ocean. Get some rest, Captain. You'll need it. Mason didn't say a word. His heart pounded in his chest, his body frozen, rooted to the spot. Every inch of him screamed to confront Riley, to demand more answers, but a gnawing feeling of helplessness kept him in place. And just like that, Riley was gone, disappearing into the night, swallowed by the storm's chaos. Mason stood there for what felt like an eternity. The storm raged, the ship rocked, but his thoughts were elsewhere. His memories, his choices, the life he had known. None of it made sense anymore. What had started as a routine voyage had become something much darker, much more dangerous. But the real question was, could he escape it? Could he ever get out? A voice cut through the fog in his mind. "You've always been part of it." It echoed through his skull like a haunting refrain. The next morning, the storm passed, leaving behind only the wreckage of the night. The Argonaut Belle was undamaged, though the crew moved slowly, groggily recovering from the ordeal. Mason, however, wasn't just recovering from the storm. He was recovering from a realization far more terrifying. He was already trapped. He didn't know who had orchestrated the events, but he knew it was no longer just about the ship or the crew. It was about the system that had used him, a system that wanted him involved, whether he liked it or not. And Mason had just crossed the point of no return. Would he expose the conspiracy? Or would he take his place as another silent piece in the vast, dark puzzle that stretched far beyond the Argonaut Belle? The choice, it seemed, had already been made for him, because silence was survival. As the Argonaut Belle sailed onward, Mason's hands gripped the wheel with more force than he intended. The horizon was a faint line ahead. He didn't know where they were heading, but he knew one thing: nothing would ever be the same. This was his life now. The question was, how long would it take before the storm swallowed him whole? And what about you, the viewer? If you were in Mason's shoes, would you confront the truth or choose silence, just to survive? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and share what you would do if you were captain. Like, comment, and subscribe to stay with us as the story unfolds. And don't forget to hit that bell so you'll always be notified when new stories come to light. The ocean holds many secrets, and sometimes those secrets find their way to us. Until next time.